Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Geraldine Coggins, one of the Oxford for Europe organisers, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. It's a joy to see so many people, and I think that's a tribute to our distinguished speakers. So we have a good evening ahead. If you are new to Oxford for Europe, you may be interested to receive our newsletter, and if you'd like to do that, you can sign up for it at our stall, which is just behind me here after the speeches. And you may have noticed that on your chair there's a postcard. It's for your MP, and Oxford for Europe has been designing postcards to send to MPs for people to express their views about Brexit, and particularly a no-deal Brexit. If you would like to sign it and put it in the postbox, which will be at the back of the hall at the end, we will deliver it for you. Or you can take it away and post it yourself. And it's worth writing to your MP whether you know that they're pro or against Brexit, because MPs who are against Brexit do need the support of their constituents. We're a campaigning group against Brexit, Oxford for Europe. We're all volunteers and we work on a very small budget. At the end of the event, there will be 2 people at the back with collection buckets, and if you feel so minded, we'd be very grateful if you could make a donation. I also want to mention that there's a march in London on October the 19th against Brexit, organised by the People's Vote organisation. We would urge you to go. Oxford for Europe is organising some coaches, so you can come with us, and you can book for that through our website. There's a link on our newsletter, and there's also a link on our Facebook page. And what do you wear when you go to a march? Well, the well-dressed marcher wears an EU beret, as modelled by Annette over there. And if you would like a beret, we do have some for sale. They're on our stall behind me, and they are £10. I've been asked to mention that the Oxford Labour Remain is organising an event on Friday the 13th, that's this Friday, in Cowley, and they will be handing leaflets out about it at the end, but just a heads up about it now. It's to hear more about the impact on Oxford should we have a no-deal Brexit, and particularly the impact on BMW. Thank you. And I'd like now to hand over to Dr. Jocasta Gardner, our chairperson for tonight, who is going to do the interesting bit of the meeting. Thank you.
To this Oxford for Europe event. It's absolutely wonderful to have such a full church. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Rachel Clarke and Gavin Esler this evening to speak on the theme of Brexit Unspun, overcoming the Web of Deceit. Unfortunately, due to events in Westminster, Lord Andrew Adonis has been unable to join us at the last minute. So, a brief word on the format of this evening. Rachel will speak first about Brexit and the NHS in its widest sense: patients, staff, research, morale. She will then be followed by Gavin, who will speak about the topics in his most recent book, Brexit Without the Bullshit: The Facts on Food, Jobs, Schools and the NHS, whilst avoiding overlap or repetition of Rachel on the NHS. Each have been asked to speak for about 15 minutes. You, the audience, will then have the opportunity to ask questions. Please could I ask you to make sure you keep your questions short and to the point, so that as many of you as possible have the opportunity to ask a question. We have 2 roving microphones, and again, please make sure you speak into the microphone by holding it as close as possible to you. The just to say is, if you don't want to be filmed or captured for social media, please say so before you ask your question, so that we can turn off the camera. At the end, I shall ask Rachel and Gavin each to give a short summary to conclude, and there will then be a final opportunity for you to get your book signed once we have finished, noting that our speakers need to leave shortly after 9 p.m. So, I shall briefly introduce Rachel. Rachel Clarke started her career as a journalist before retraining as a doctor, and now specialises in palliative care in Oxfordshire. In the dispute between junior doctors and the government a couple of years ago, Rachel became active as a campaigner on behalf of doctors, junior doctors, and the NHS. She recounts her experiences in her book, Your Life in My Hands, a junior doctor's story, published in 2017. Rachel has continued campaigning ever since, using her profile and voice to make clear the damaging effects of our current political situation and Brexit on the NHS. Rachel, you concluded your book, Your Life in My Hands, in 2017 by saying that the patient whose status gave you the greatest concern was the NHS itself, and that its fate rested in all of our hands. What is your assessment today? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak this evening. I guess first and foremost I should say I'm speaking as an individual. These are my personal views. They don't represent my employer at all. Otherwise I'll get into trouble with my NHS trust. I'm really delighted to speak this evening because any of you who follow me on Twitter will know that I care desperately about trying to stop, first and foremost, a no-deal Brexit, but ideally any form of Brexit. And that is because, more than any other reason, I am deeply committed to my NHS patients and their well-being. We take a Hippocratic oath when we become doctors, and our first duty, our most important duty, is to act in the best interests of our patients. I believe very, very strongly that part of that duty is a duty of candour. It is speaking out on behalf of patients, drawing attention to harms, whether these are actual harms or potential harms. And for me, that means speaking out about Brexit isn't a choice, it is a duty as far as I'm concerned. We all know that patients are by and large, a vulnerable group in British society. There is a clear socio-economic gradient in health, and patients typically are not cushioned by the multi-million-pound bank balances of Arron Banks or Nigel Farage. Patients typically do not have enormous wealth, power, status, or voice in society, and within that vulnerable group of patients, there are some groups that are even more vulnerable than others. So I'm thinking, for instance, of groups like patients with mental illnesses, with disabilities, are elderly, and a group that is incredibly dear to my heart as a palliative care doctor, patients who are terminally ill and who are approaching the end of their life. These groups do not have a voice. They are not heard on BBC Question Time, or they're not spread across social media, Facebook and Twitter, and I think anything a doctor can do to amplify those unheard voices and advocate on behalf of people who don't have that kind of power and reach is hugely important. Doctors are lucky. We do have status in society. Alongside our magnificent nursing colleagues, doctors and nurses are the two most trusted professions in Britain today. And doctors are a highly educated group, so we learn both scientific appraisal skills and also communication skills. So we, in a way, are uniquely placed to advocate on behalf of patients. If you like me at the moment, you're probably reeling almost hour by hour by the speed, the alacrity with which political events are changing in Westminster. And so I thought it would be helpful to pause and take stop for a moment and go back to 2016 and think about Brexit in relation to the NHS from that point. Brexit was sold to Britain then on a bus proclaiming that it would be better for our health. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. As if a man like Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage would for 1 second think about committing an extra £350 million a week to the NHS. Both of them are on the record on a number of occasions as advocating further privatisation of the NHS and a private insurance alternative to the NHS. The NHS may be the jewel in Britain's crown, but it has never been a priority for the likes of Nigel Farage. Instead of improving healthcare, the actual real-world harms of Brexit on the NHS are not hypothetical. They began all the way back in 2016, even before the referendum took place. When you think back to that Vote Leave campaign in the run-up to the referendum, it was viciously toxic, it was viciously xenophobic, and that had a devastating impact on morale in the NHS workforce, which is one of the most diverse and multicultural workforces in Britain. 1 in 8 nurses, NHS nurses, are from the EU27, and 1 in 10 doctors are from the EU27. I work with extraordinary men and women in the NHS from Spain, Italy, Portugal, Poland, all across mainland Europe, and every single one of them are vital, irreplaceable members of our health service, and we as a country should be shouting from the rooftops our gratitude for our EU colleagues in the NHS. Instead, in that campaign, they were subjected, along with everybody from Europe living in Britain today, to a toxic and racist campaign that left many of my colleagues feeling unwanted, unvalued, and in some ways persecuted as the campaign went on. The context to this couldn't be more serious. So you mentioned the end of my book. I said at the end of that book that the patient whose state is most vulnerable at the moment is the institution of the NHS itself, and that couldn't be more true. We are currently short of 100,000 staff in the NHS. We are short of 40,000 nurses and 10,000 doctors, so we can't afford to lose a single one of our precious EU colleagues. And yet, that's exactly what started to happen in 2016. Because of the way in which Vote Leave conducted their campaign, it started to erode NHS morale, and it started to cause EU staff to quit. Not because they wanted to, but because they started to feel as though the country they had called home no longer felt like home. Two vignettes to illustrate that. So, on the morning after the Brexit referendum, I arrived at my place of work to see my consultant, my boss, on the steps of the hospital. She is a wonderful consultant, originally from Italy. She looked at me and she burst into tears, and we hugged on the steps, and she was crying because she couldn't believe the result, that this result had happened in the country she called home. The next day was a Saturday, the first Saturday after the referendum, and an optometrist working in the local eye hospital here in Oxfordshire went about doing their work on a Saturday, very busy, very crowded eye emergency unit. And somebody stood up, a young man, maybe 19 or 20, and the optometrist was from Poland, had a Polish accent, and this youth started shouting at the top of his voice, "Effing well, go back to where you effing well come from. We don't want the likes of you here." That was 2 days after the referendum. Had never experienced anything like it before. It was so shocking. A third vignette that I'd like to share, a local vignette, is from last year. In a hospice, inpatient beds are like gold dust. There are so many patients in need with difficult symptoms at the end of life who need the very intensive care and support that we can give as a palliative care team in an inpatient setting. Last year, the hospice where I worked was forced to close, fortunately temporarily, but for many months, a third of its inpatient beds. And the reason for that closure was because the hospice could not recruit or retain sufficient nurses to keep those beds open. And that was because some of the very, very best nurses that I worked with, who were from Portugal, Spain, Italy, those three countries in particular, felt as though they could no longer stay in the UK, and they left. So as a direct consequence of that toxic xenophobic rhetoric from people like Nigel Farage, ably heightened by people like Boris Johnson, now our Prime Minister, a hospice closed a third of its beds, leaving patients at home unable to come in and receive the care they so desperately needed at the end of their life, a direct harm from Brexit. And this isn't something that's unique to Oxfordshire, of course. We know from national data that some trusts are reporting a 40% increase in their numbers of EU staff who are quitting, who are leaving the NHS. That is since the Brexit referendum. In short, of course, and we all know this, Brexit is very, very far from benefiting our health. It is instead causing a whole succession of losses, some of which have already begun, and the most important of which I would argue is that desperate loss of people, the staff who are the very lifeblood of our NHS. We are losing them, we're hemorrhaging them because of Brexit. The other losses, I am sure you're very well versed in, being an Oxford audience. Those are losses of money. The Treasury predictions for the economic cost of a no-deal Brexit are up to £90 billion a year, and of course, if that happens, the NHS is going to be desperately underfunded, even more than it is already. There's a loss of access to European institutions such as the European Medicines Agency, which has already left its UK base in London. And crucially, when we consider a no-deal Brexit, there is the loss of access to a streamlined medicines supply chain. That, of course, comes with our membership of the Single Market and the Customs Union. 8,000 different medicines and medical devices come from mainland Europe. Over 3/4 of all of our medicines come from across the Channel. Nobody is pretending that that Europe is going to somehow punitively deny Britain and the NHS those medicines, but the sheer logistics of getting them across the border in the event of no deal are dire. I'm sure you've all read the extensive media coverage of the recent Yellowhammer leaks. So this is the report that the civil service prepared for the government, giving not remotely a worst case scenario, but simply their best guesses of the impact of a no-deal Brexit on every aspect of British life. And for the NHS, that report was absolutely chilling. No matter how hard you try and prepare, you cannot stockpile all drugs and medicines because some of them have too short a half-life. So radioisotopes, which are used in both the diagnosis of and treatment of some cancers, cannot be stockpiled. There are many other drugs such as insulin, which is life-threatening, its absence is life-threatening for type 1 diabetics, and flu vaccines, which are going to be vital this winter when the annual flu epidemic hits this country, that need to be refrigerated. And even though Matt Hancock has loved to joke, oh so jovially, about being the world's biggest buyer of fridges, it is no joke. If we don't have the capacity for those drugs, our patients' lives will be put at risk. We're, in a way, approaching a perfect storm with no-deal Brexit. There are two almighty pressures facing the NHS this winter: the annual winter crisis, where the increase in illness that always accompanies a winter and cold weather is going to put the NHS under enormous strain, as it does every winter. We are also facing this year a particularly virulent flu crisis. We know from Australia that it's already in its winter and is already going through its flu spike, but this year's strains are unusually virulent. So that is going to be a second huge pressure on the NHS. throwing into that mix at the end of October the negative impact on the health service of a no-deal Brexit is so irresponsible, it sickens me. To my mind, the idea that a Prime Minister could even contemplate subjecting patients to those risks shows that this is a man who, far from putting the national interest first, clearly doesn't give a damn about patients. I find it astonishing. So if all of that sounds bleak, I guess I'd like to finish by saying, well, what can we do about it? I mean, we're all sitting here, we're all committed, we all want to stop this, and it's easy to feel completely impotent, as though nothing we can do can change anything. We are all just little tiny flies with no power whatsoever. And I think one of the reasons we might think that is because there are very, very many pressures and voices that are deliberately trying to make us think that. We can all do something because we live in a democracy. We don't live in North Korea. All of us have a voice and we can all use it. We can all speak out. And speaking out is an act. It is a form of agency. Nobody gets to silence somebody living in a democracy without their consent. So if we stay silent because we've given up, we've lost all hope, we think nothing can change, then we have chosen not to use our voice. And I would say, don't be silenced with your consent. It doesn't matter how small or quiet you feel your voice is, it matters in a democracy. Your voice may only be a murmur individually, but if your voice unites with that of your friends and your family and your neighbours, that murmur becomes a roar. And we have seen that roar over and over again in the last 3 years. The situation is only hopeless if we give up. And it is only inevitable if we stop saying this is unacceptable and we will not allow it. And it's only Armageddon if we let it happen. So I guess my message to all of you would be, use your democratic voice because it's priceless. It's what everybody who, I know that Brexiteers love using the legacy of the Second World War over and over again. But if there was one thing my grandfather fought for, it was our democratic voice. Let's use it. Even if all you do is put out a tweet, write something on social media, write to your MP, use your voice. If we all do it, then we are a roar and we can stop this. I truly believe that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I shall briefly introduce Gavin. He is a Scottish journalist and author, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, he presented the BBC's Newsnight for many, many years. He has campaigned against Brexit for quite a long time, and recently stood as a candidate for Change UK in the European parliamentary elections. His recent book, which you may buy, does what it says on the tin and provides the facts on food, jobs, schools, and the NHS and Brexit. Let's hear some more facts. Gavin, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin with 2 bits of good news. One is Rachel. Thank you. And the other is the rest of us, because we're here, and we're here for the same reason, because we care about our country and we want to take our country back, and I think it is possible. So thank you for coming. Now, not so good news. It's been an odd week, hasn't it? The European Union, the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell and the former Chancellor Philip Hammond, among many others, have all been saying publicly that they regard the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom as not telling us the truth about many things, including the reason why he's decided to ask the Queen to prorogue Parliament. And I agree with that judgment. So I want to talk a little bit about something that I think is actually bigger than Brexit. It is the normalization of lying in our public life. When I voted in 2016, I didn't really know what Brexit was about. And I embarked on writing this book, Brexit Without Bullshit, with some trepidation, because I did say to the publisher, if we stripped all the BS from it, would it be a book of empty pages? Unfortunately, I found quite a lot that Brexit will mean to us, the realities of Brexit. And what is interesting to me in our public life now is that the government has gone to great lengths to avoid telling us the truth. They even said that the Yellowhammer documents were out of date. They're from August. They know that the economic forecasts for no deal are dire, and they also know that the biggest sin in British political life has been actually to tell the truth. Ask Kim Darroch. So Kim Darroch, our former ambassador to Washington, had to leave his job because he told the truth about the mess that Donald Trump had made in the United States. So I decided that I would try and swim against that current and try and find out some facts about Brexit, facts that I wish I had known when we voted. I wish we'd all known when we voted. And just to give you one example of how corrosive this normalization of lying has been, I had 4 weeks in a political party which didn't change the world, but it was very valuable. It was very interesting. And like you coming here, it was just something I thought I could do. And I met a woman in Oxford Street when I was out campaigning, just off Oxford Street in London. And she said to me, she wouldn't take a flyer I was handing out, which is fine. She said, I'm not going to vote for you, I'm going to vote for Nigel Farage. And I said, do you mind if I ask you why? And she said, yes, because the European Union is completely undemocratic. And I said, and you're ahead of me here, aren't you? So you're voting in an election for a person who's already a member of the European Parliament. Could you just tell me the bits of that that are undemocratic? And she said, I hadn't thought of it like that. Now, I promise you that she did not vote for me. But she has obviously, like the rest of us, endured years and years of nonsense and lies about the European Union and some of the benefits that it brings us. And so when I produced the book, or just before the book actually went out, I got my first review. But it couldn't have been a review from anybody who'd read the book, because apart from the publisher and me, nobody had. So I'd like to read you the review of the book. Dangerous propaganda in an illiterate package. There's every chance this assembly of extremist fantasies will prove of adequate sophistication to appeal to today's rabid left-wing extremists. That's you. So that even slightly educated, it will appear too crass and vulgar to bear. This book is the product of a man, that's me, who projects his fantasies over reality almost to the point of psychosis. Fair enough. But that appeared on Amazon before the books went out. So when I talk about the normalization of lying, it goes all the way from 10 Downing Street to some bloke, I'm sure it was a bloke, sitting at home reviewing a book he couldn't possibly have read. The thing is, facts are at the core of our Enlightenment values in this great university city. They're about medicine and science and all the things that we hold dear. And we, I fear, if we let the people who are lying to us about Brexit get away with this, they'll lie to us about other things too. They will turn the Enlightenment values that we all value on their head, and we will enter some kind of unenlightenment, or as more commonly known, Trumpland. Boris Johnson, as we know, has had a track record of lies. He was fired twice for lying. And now he's proroguing Parliament, he says, because he wants to get on with his exciting agenda on crime and the NHS. An Ipsos Mori poll showed that 70% of us don't believe the Prime Minister. Dominic Grieve, apparently tonight, I haven't actually seen it, but some people have been tweeting that Dominic Grieve has said in the House of Commons that he has evidence that the Queen was misled on this subject. Now, if that's true, I think we may hear more of that in the future. So, I wanted to have a quick look at some of the facts, and just very briefly, leaving the European Union will change pretty much everything in our lives. Mrs. Thatcher, it seemed to me, compared to what we're embarking on now, was a bit of an underachiever. I mean, all she did was she defeated the miners, she neutralised trade union power, she privatised state assets, including council houses, she revitalised the City of London, she helped win the Cold War, and she defeated the Argentine junta. But this was a limited ambition compared to Boris Johnson, because he is engaged in rewriting simultaneously the core of our foreign economic and trade policies, with profound impacts on everything from the NHS, as you've heard, from nurses and social care, to the food we eat, to the vets that we have employed, to our jobs and investment, our universities, and our soft power as a brainy country that gets things done. He may also, by the way, destroy the Conservative Party. Which is clearly a source of mourning among others. Our food supplies, just for example, most of the people who pick our seasonal fruit and vegetables turn out to be from the EU 27 and not British. 95% of vets in our slaughterhouses turn out to be not British, they're EU 27 nationals. Our food standards are seriously at risk from a rushed trade deal with the United States. I don't believe actually a rushed trade deal will happen, because it will get chewed up in Congress. And if you think I'm going to talk about chlorinated chicken, you're wrong. I've eaten chlorinated chicken. I'm still alive. It was not something that I would recommend. It's not a good way of raising chickens, and it's a way of kind of in an emergency measure, making sure that there are fewer bugs in them. I want to talk about something called ractopamine in pork. American pork is banned in the EU and about 100 other countries, including those countries that we look to for the highest food standards, Russia and China. And the reason it's banned, well, you can Google it and have a look. But what's interesting about this is that the US trade representative, who's the person who will actually negotiate a trade deal with Liz Truss, if we get that far, has been holding public hearings from, among others, the food lobby. And there are, I now discovered, having sat through some of these hearings, 60,000 pork producers in the United States. They're in 42 different states. That means 84 members of the US Senate will listen to them. They're politically very powerful. And they have said Britain must take American pork as one of the conditions for a trade deal. Otherwise, there won't be a trade deal. Now, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson may be right, but I would suggest to you that 84 senators will tend to listen to the 60,000 pork producers in the United States and will make life very difficult. Now, all these things could be sorted out by negotiation, but we are in a very weak position, especially if we crack out. There's lots of things put at risk. Pharmaceuticals we could talk about, insulin, for example. Viagra, gentlemen, it all comes from Ringaskiddy in County Cork, so if you need it, perhaps now would be a good time to stock up. The ultimate Brexit risk, I would say, actually, is called the United Kingdom. This United Kingdom is increasingly disunited, not just because of those horrible verbal and other attacks on people who happen to come from other countries who made this place their home and enrich our country. But every one of the 32 electoral districts in Scotland voted to remain. Northern Ireland voted to remain. I was brought up in Scotland in a unionist family with unionists from Northern Ireland. I have to tell you that things are changing there. And if we crash out, my guess is that Scotland will have another independence vote, and it may be won by the Nationals. So we could lose, among other things, what we think of as the United Kingdom. Our reputation around the world has also been seriously damaged. I travel quite a lot and I read quite a lot of foreign newspapers. Just to give you a couple of examples, a very sober German news magazine described Jacob Rees-Mogg as potentially our next Prime Minister. They then described him as das lebende Fossil, which you will know means the living fossil. In Ireland, Boris Johnson's characterisation of the Irish border as being similar to that between Islington and Camden is a constant source of amusement. I've lived in Islington, Camden, and in Ireland. There's no resemblance. In the United States, the New York Times devoted a page and a half to a man they call Failing Grayling. And that raises one of the great mysterious questions of our times. How do you become Chris Grayling? I haven't got time to figure that out. And then we've had the French government minister who joked that she had nicknamed her cat Brexit because it can't decide what to do. What? Or stay in. I said to my wife I was going to nickname our dog Farage because it leaves a pile of poo behind and I have to clear it up. But that was vetoed. And the one that really gets me, I've got a friend, a journalist, who was in Venezuela for a while. And while he was in Venezuela and there was troops on the streets and there was rioting and there was shooting and there was all kinds of things, he took refuge and he happened to be talking on his mobile phone in English. And some Venezuelans came up and said, are you British? We hear things are really bad. I spent 1 year of my life on one lie, and that one lie was I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. That wasn't me, by the way, I was in character. And it nearly brought down the president. But now lying has become so commonplace in the United States, and I would suggest to you over here that we're in trouble. A British statesman of the 19th century, Sir Henry Taylor, said, falsehood ceases to be falsehood when it's understood on all sides that the truth is not expected to be spoken. Well, Donald Trump, according to the Washington Post, which keeps account, and maybe we should do this in our country, says that President Trump has made 12,019 false or misleading statements over the 928 days of the presidency, which is an average of 13 a day. The man is a workaholic when it comes to telling things like that. And the New York Times said, Donald Trump lies all the time. We know that. Some of us are incensed and disgusted by it. Others have been worn out by it. But few even attempt to deny or excuse it anymore. It has simply become a recognized feature of the man and a predicament for the country. And my worry is that Brexit and the falsehoods that we have been told mean that we are on our way to going along this route, and that people don't care anymore. They don't care that they're hearing lies. And just to pick up one example, which was the infamous referendum bus. I mean, we all remember, and Rachel alluded to it, that claim about 350 million a week to the European Union. Well, the UK Statistics Authority said it was a clear misuse of official statistics, which is a nice way of saying it was a lie. But the key part, and I hope this is something that we can all take home after this meeting, the key part wasn't the ridiculous claim that we're going to get 350 million a week. It said underneath, let's fund the NHS instead. That was an appeal to the heart, to the way we feel. And one of the things I think we can learn from Johnson and Trump and others is that while facts are important, which is why I put them in the book, how we feel and how people who voted for Brexit feel is also important. And those of us who want to turn this around have to connect with them. I feel that the earth is flat because when I'm here, that's what works for me. I know it's round. Those of us who are privileged to have a good education, those of us who are privileged to be able to see what these facts are, have to find a way to communicate to our fellow citizens why this is important without the desperation that will result if we do fall off that cliff. And finally, let me give you one example again from America, just because I fear that we are going down this route. During the 2016 election campaign, the facts suggested that Donald Trump had lied about crime in America, violent crime in America. And Newt Gingrich, former Republican Speaker of the House, was on television, and he was being interrogated by this very good TV presenter from CNN. And she said to him, that's just wrong. The guy who wants to be our president is not telling the truth. And what Gingrich said was, the average American this morning does not think violent crime is down. The current view is that liberals have a whole set of statistics that theoretically may be correct, but that's not where human beings are. People feel they're threatened, and I'll go with how people feel. And of course, we had the more sophisticated version in our country that the British people have had enough of experts. By a man who, believe me, if he feels sick, goes to a doctor, he doesn't go to some bloke in the pub. We have not had enough of experts, but the way in which our public discourse has been affected over the past 3 years is very, very serious. We have to get back to the basic Enlightenment values of facts, but we also have to find a way, it seems to me, of connecting with people who voted for Brexit, connect with their feelings about this country, about their misuse of their patriotism, and try to figure out how we can turn it around. And I believe we can. I'd just like to conclude with what I think is the populist paradox. The populist paradox is that people like Trump and Johnson are very, very good at connecting with some people because they touch their feelings. But the facts will win out in the end. Trump has not built his Mexican wall. He has not negotiated an arms control deal with Korea. And Boris Johnson, for all his bloviating, has not built a garden bridge. He's not built a bridge between Scotland and Ireland. He's not built an airport on the sands. What's this about building, this guy? And he has not lied. He didn't lie in front of bulldozers at Heathrow. However, if he did lie in front of Her Majesty the Queen, I think he's in real trouble. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for two very illuminating talks. Now is your opportunity to ask questions. And can I just remind you, please keep it to a question and no commentary. Can I start with you over here, the lady just at the front?
Hi, Kim Sanders Fisher. I hear a lot of people talking about how foreigners are taking our jobs away, and that's the whole big issue. But back in 2009, I did a 10-country tour of sub-Saharan Africa, and I saw the damage done by scavenging medical workers from countries that couldn't afford to train them. The whole idea of, we scavenge, exploit, and deport. And we're going to have that on steroids after this Brexit goes through. Because instead of having people from the EU who have the same rights as us, we'll be scavenging people from much further afield that have no rights, and that's who people in this country will be competing with for jobs.
So what's the question?
I just wondered what the NHS, what you thought about that component of it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I mean, when you have a shortfall of 100,000 staff, of course you end up looking abroad as well as at home for how you're going to fill all of those jobs. In an ideal world, clearly we would be investing in sufficient medical schools, sufficient nursing degree places, so that we could populate the NHS workforce in a way that didn't rely on recruiting tens of thousands of staff from abroad. Although I don't in any sense see any of my non-British NHS colleagues as in any way inferior or lesser doctors, nurses and all the other healthcare professionals. I do think there's a real question about whether or not the NHS is causing other international health services to suffer by in a sense, stealing those staff. That's difficult because the staff who come and work in the NHS from abroad, first of all, they're making a free choice to do that. No one is being made to move against their will, and sometimes they're doing that precisely because they can earn more and they can help their families back home, for instance, through their higher salary. They're also sometimes, in many cases, people come to the NHS for a period of time because that helps their professional development. And then if they do return back home to their country of origin, then they may be bringing the skills and expertise that they've learned in the NHS back to their country of origin. So I don't think it's simply the case that somehow the NHS is kind of scavenging its international workforce, but it is undeniably the case that the gaps in the workforce are already being exacerbated by Brexit and will continue to do so. And very sadly, in the absence of a government that has any kind of track record for addressing the understaffing crisis that the NHS has been going through really since 2010, it's difficult to see how that's going to be resolved, and it may well result in your term scavenging going across the globe trying to scour other countries for staff. I mean, that already happens. The NHS is constantly attempting to recruit staff from India, from a huge number of non-EU countries. You know, the Philippines, a huge number of nurses from the Philippines, for instance. It's not good.
Some cope better than others. Some countries are coping better than others, like the Philippines, but, you know, and India.
Yeah.
And Africa, it really hurts.
Okay. Do you want to say anything? Do we have another question? We have the lady right here.
Rebecca Lewis, in my village I'm known as the Brexit Bore, and what I'd like, please, is some advice about how you talk to people about Brexit without being accused of being dull or superior or, just killing the party.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question, and it's a very difficult question to answer because obviously each recipient of your wisdom on this is going to be different. I think there are some people you will never reach. There are some people who will say, just get on with it. When that happens, I actually say, you realise that it will take a very, very long time. It's not an event, it's a process, and the process will actually begin if we leave by November the 1st. On November the 1st, the process will begin. And talk to them about the facts. And the Brexit borderline, what I tend to say is, if you're bored now, wait till we have the next 5 to 10 years of discussing with the European Union what our trading relationship is going to be, with the United States what our trading relationship would be. I'm bored with it too. I wish we didn't have to talk about it. But the only way to stop Brexit is to stop Brexit. That's the only way to stop talking about it. If we don't...
And I just have one very quick suggestion to add to that, which is don't talk, listen, because there's nothing worse, in a medical sphere, there's nothing worse than a know-it-all doctor who is trying to force Mr. Smith to take his statin, even though Mr. Smith is absolutely convinced that it's going to affect his performance in bed with his wife. For instance, it doesn't matter how much you harangue or seek to influence Mr. Smith, he's not going to buy it. If you stop for a second and listen to Mr. Smith and ask him what his concerns are, you discover actually that you have common ground, you have something to have a discussion about. And to me it seems exactly the same with Brexit. It is not remotely the case that everybody who voted for Brexit and everybody who wants Brexit today is xenophobic or racist or stupid or all those other insults that get hurled around social media. Millions of these people are people with legitimate fears and concerns, just as we all have legitimate fears and concerns, and surely the way to have a dialogue is to listen to those, to respect them, take them seriously, and use that as the start of common ground to have a conversation.
We have the gentleman right in there.
Mr. Harris, vote for Remain Now. In late 1993, 600,000 people purchased the Mrs. Blogger single, making it the #1 record in 3 weeks, including the prize, Christmas #1. In July 2019, 92,153 people, or 508,000 fewer, voted Boris Johnson to be the UK Prime Minister. The former is often cited as the worst record ever. Does this, with the longest prorogue of Parliament in years, say more about the shit show that is the current political system, or about the musical taste of 26 years ago?
Well, I'm not an authority on Mr. Blobby, to be honest, but look, I think the big picture for me is this. There are really, really good people in politics, on all parties actually, who are trying to do their best, but the system is fundamentally broken. And it's broken in all sorts of ways, but that's one way. 0.25% of us, 0.25% have voted for the person who's now our Prime Minister. And of course we will get a chance to vote, but again, with the first past the post system, another part that I think is also broken, some arguments will be heard that will not lead to people ending up in Parliament who perhaps should be, and we've had that before. So a reform of our system, it seems to me, is absolutely essential. And there will be some kind of day of reckoning after this, either because the United Kingdom is threatened with breaking up, or because people say, you know, this wonderful mystery of the unwritten constitution that we're supposed to love. Well, I don't love it, actually. I like it written down, so I know exactly where we stand.
A question probably for Gavin. I mean, since when we watch politicians on television being interviewed by top presenters on all the big programmes from Sky and BBC and others, we know most of the time, or much of the time, that they are lying. What bothers me is that we don't see the presenters challenging. And how rare is it to see a presenter actually accuse the politician of lying? Why are they afraid of that? Is it that in fact that their bosses are telling them not to, or is it that in fact they're not being properly resourced and prepared with the facts so they actually know that something is a lie? Because we can see it time and time again. And if we look at someone like Boris, you know that virtually everything I shouldn't have said Boris, actually, I say Johnson. Virtually everything he says is a lie. Thank you.
Well, I agree with much of what you said there, actually. And for example, in recent days, we've heard him saying that there'll be no problem selling British beef to the United States, but we don't expect the Americans will want to sell beef to this country, which is so fatuous and clearly wrong. But what happens, of course, is that on the front pages of almost every newspaper, there was a picture of him holding a cow. And that would be a success as far as that is concerned. And I agree, there is a trap for the media. So it can be very difficult and very wearing constantly to say that somebody is lying. And in the United States, to take that example, the Washington Post does it by counting it. But if I'm just trying to imagine what it would be like if you really believe that the President of the United States is saying 12 or 13 lies a day, if you have to report on that, every time he says it, should you say it's a lie? Well, it would be good if it was possible. But I think there's a bigger issue about the media, or two bigger issues actually. One is, I don't know how you fix this, but I personally don't think it's a great idea that the most popular newspapers in this country tend to be owned by people who are non-resident for tax purposes. I think that's shocking. And the second thing, I think, is that all television and radio outlets have got to redefine what they mean by balance. It is not balanced. Thank you. It would be balanced to have Labour and the Conservatives, or Northern Ireland Unionists and the Nationalists. That's all absolutely fine. But if Rachel has a view about a medical condition that affects you, you're not going to ask me, because I haven't got a clue. And that sense that you can somehow balance people with expertise in a subject with people who have no expertise has effects on climate science, for example, on measles vaccination. We've had various people opining about measles vaccines who know nothing about vaccination or have no scientific credibility. And I know journalists are worried about this, but they need to do something about it. And I think now would be a good time.
Remain, whether that's a referendum, people's vote, whatever, or whether we just have to make do with the no-deal Brexit. I'm just, confused, I suppose.
Well, my own view is that those are not the only two options. Clearly, we don't know how things are going to progress. I think what's going to be critical, in addition to when the inevitable election takes place is what the position of the official opposition, the Labour Party, is going to be. And if that's going to be very, very interesting, because are they going to back a second referendum? Are they going to back Remain in that referendum? And if I had any influence in Westminster, I would be doing everything in my power to lobby Jeremy Corbyn and Seamus Milne and all his advisors as to the electoral benefits of standing in the forthcoming general election as a Remain party. That's my fantasy. Whether or not that will happen, don't know. You may have
Well, I agree with a lot of that. I think, to sum it up, Remain. Absolutely Remain. I mean, I think there should be a people's vote. I hope there will be a people's vote, and I hope it will come before a general election. And I hope that some people in government will recognise that gets everybody off the hook. You can't betray the people by giving the people another say. You can't say that you have to respect something from 2016 forever, given the basic failures to do it. I mean, I respect the result of the Battle of Hastings, but I don't live in 1066. And I also think that things are moving our way, because people have finally been told some of the facts, even though the facts are being denied by the government. And facts do matter. And finally, I'm very optimistic, because the one thing I'm pretty certain of is that Boris Johnson is not actually very good.
The gentleman in the middle.
Richard Esler. The key question is, how are we going to get more traction? We have the excellent facts and opinions from our seat. And we've had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of London with placards which have told the truth. But we have not, so far, got the leverage. There are two problems, I think, and I'd like to hear what the panel think about. The first is saying that despite the presence of you two this evening, we have not had enough people of weight speaking out. Are they afraid? What's the problem? One or two, hasn't time later, but not enough. And we have to come back to the media, because it's not just a question of balance. There's the poison from the propaganda press, which is huge. And I'm sorry, but I personally think that the national broadcaster, the BBC, has profoundly failed us.
Here, here.
There has not been enough editorial courage. There has been too much Swedish following of the government line. Can we do more?
Well, I think there's a number of points there. I think, for instance, I think there have been a number of problems at the BBC and elsewhere. It's not just the BBC. I think most journalists working for the BBC and other news networks try to do the best they can. They try to tell the story as they see it. I do feel, however, the balance question is important because of the lack of expertise by some people who are on the media. I also think the use of language has been odd at times. One of the reasons I got involved just over a year ago, having been kind of somnolent and looking from the outside and being a commentator, was I heard on one BBC programme repeatedly the phrase, when Brexit happens, it will look like this. And I had no idea what this Brexit was that was supposed to be happening, because it didn't seem to be happening around me. So I agree with you to a certain extent. The bigger question, though, I think, is how do we get traction? And I think Rachel was right. First of all, we can contact our MPs. The MPs, some of them are in a very, very difficult position. Some of them are very brave. The 24 or so who've now lost the Conservative whip seems to me have been particularly brave. We need more from the Labour Party. We need leadership from the Labour Party, from the top of the Labour Party, not just good people in the Labour Party, and there are plenty of them, but leadership from the top of the Labour Party. and we need to make them understand that our vote counts. And the one other thing I think we need to do is we need to encourage the parties as much as possible to get their act together and work together, because you can perceive. I think we're all worried about something simply happening, that 30-something% of people will vote for this government, and that the Remain vote will be so severely split that we will lose if there's a general election. And that does worry me. And that's one of the reasons why I think we should have a people's vote, because I think giving the people of this country a chance to say, yes, there's Boris Johnson's deal, whatever that looks like, or Remain. That's what I would like to see, and I think we can definitely win that.
Rachel.
And just to add, this idea, your point about facts and how they don't seem to be giving us the traction that this campaign needs, well, that goes back to something you mentioned earlier, Gavin. Facts are powerful, but alone they don't motivate and sway people. You need to tell a story that people can believe in, they identify in, and that they have some kind of emotional connection with. So facts, yes, vitally important, but how do you capture people's hearts as well? That's the essence of politics. And one specific example of that I think is very telling, if you go back to 2016 and the referendum campaign, we had an incredibly toxic campaign on behalf of Vote Leave that played on all of our worst emotions, our fears, our suspicions, our anxieties about other people, immigrants, people who aren't like us. It was a very, very clever and emotionally persuasive campaign. And there was absolutely zilch on the other side, on the Remain side, about the positive benefits, the vibrancy of our multicultural Britain, the positive benefits that immigrants bring to the UK, because everybody was afraid, or at a political level, was afraid of telling that story. And I think that was an enormous mistake. And if we do have a second referendum and we continue to run scared of singing out loud and proud about the benefits of immigration to British society, then there's a real danger that we will have a lacklustre campaign, because you can guarantee that a repeat Vote Leave campaign will just go every bit as hard on toxic anti-immigrant rhetoric as they did the first time round.
Gavin hinted at the issue I want to raise, which is that politicians, I suggest that politicians these days, many politicians, are more influenced and controlled by their financial supporters than they are by their electorate. And my question is, what can we do about that? We could, I suggest, for example, publish their funding sources. We know that they are sometimes funded, sometimes illegally, apparently, in the electoral system. And secondly, greatly increase the fines that political parties and individuals have to pay when they break the law over funding.
Well, just briefly, because I know we want to get as many questions in as possible. I'm more concerned not directly with funding of individual politicians, but about all these shady so-called think tanks. I came across one which I discovered seems to be a meeting place on a Thursday night where people drink white wine, so it was really a drink tank. But they did raise a lot of money for various low-tax causes. And we need to find out who is funding them. And if they are do not have charitable status, are they funded through charities so that people can get a donation? There's all kinds of questions about this which are legitimate, which have not been answered because there's lack of transparency. And my final point, which goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, is that if you are a so-called think tank or an institute of this or that, and we don't know where you're funded, I don't think you should be regularly on television.
I have a brief question. It's about whether we can do anything to stop the dark money. 11 minutes before this meeting, I received an email from Peter Gavin of Open Democracy. Peter said that they have been discussing with close confidence of Johnson and Farage about secret plotting that is going on between them. Johnson and Farage are plotting to join forces. Several big donors of Tories, for the Tories, and for Farage, if there is a pact. Aaron Banks, who is under questioning for the National Crime Agency, has offered to make a substantial contribution. We do not want any rerun of the dark money. He asked for a donation to Open Democracy. I'd urge you to do that because they are finding out things. Can we do anything to stop it?
Well, yes, we can. We can find out where the money comes from and so on in the way I suggested. But there's something bigger going on here, which is that it will not have escaped the notice of everybody in this room that conservative leaders who pander to the far right of their party come to quite a sticky end over Europe. We have seen, I think, 6 since Edward Heath who have had trouble on the right of their party, including John Major. Of course, Mrs. Thatcher had trouble on both sides of the party about this. And we've had 3 leaders in 3 years, with Cameron and Mrs. May, both eaten alive. So one of the things that happens is if Boris Johnson is really, I don't know anything about this story, but if Boris Johnson is really engaged in some kind of pact with Nigel Farage, I think that's rather like the ancient Greeks sending their children to play around with a minotaur. He may end up being eaten by the Brexitor.
Really right at the back in the far corner.
Judy Gannon. I'm really interested to know what you think about the idea of tackling the motive aspect of Brexit by doing something similar to what they did in Ireland about abortion. We stop the clock, we revoke, and we have people's assemblies to talk about this properly. And I wonder what you think of that.
Well, I think that any strategy that gets people talking is clearly the way forward. So at the moment, both sides are incredibly entrenched. There is vicious rhetoric flying backwards and forwards in both directions. I spend a reasonable amount of time on social media, and that's always an extreme, heightened version of, I hope, anyway, of what's happening in the real world. But it's pretty vicious there. Clearly, a lot of the viciousness is coming from a position of either anxiety, fear, or immense frustration that you're shouting into the void and you're not being heard, you're not being listened to. And we've heard a lot about, in both America and in Britain, about the vast swathes of both countries who feel abandoned by and alienated from the political elites. And I think that's a very valid and entirely understandable position. If that's your perspective and someone steps in and gives you a fantasy narrative that makes you believe things are going to go better and most importantly you're being listened to, then why would you not embrace that? So the way to address that is to listen to people and actually to take seriously what you're being told. That's always the way to resolve a conflict. It's always the way to move forward. If it can happen in Northern Ireland, not just with abortion, but with the peace process as well, then it absolutely can happen with Brexit here and now. Yeah, I think People's Assembly is a brilliant idea.
I'd add just a couple of quick thoughts on that. One is that Theresa May made a number of mistakes, and one of them was to talk about the will of the people when the people's will was clearly split down the middle. What she should have done is not press the Article 50 button. I understand why she did it, but she shouldn't have done that. She should have done what you said, which is have some kind of assemblies and discussions across this very divided country to try to bring us together. The only thing I would say is I'm not in favour of revoking if we can possibly do things another way, because that would absolutely play into the hands of the Brexiters, who would say, oh, well, it's all undemocratic, they didn't like the result last time, so they just changed it. I would like a democratic vote that shows we have changed our minds.
Yeah, exactly.
Robert to Newtown. Just a quick comment on one of the things that's been talked about, politicians lying. Shortly after the June 2016 referendum, there was, I believe, in early day motions in the Common Commons to try and establish the equivalent of the laws of slander and libel for people in the Advertising Standards Authority for adverts, so that at least politicians couldn't put lies in election literature. And somebody might want to look into what became of that, because it's a body that's clearly needed, an independent body that people can appeal to and say that's a lie. I'd like to ask the panel's opinion on something that really never gets talked about in these discussions, and certainly in the media, and that's all the other aspects of the EU besides trade and beef and all of those things. There are 2 European Union orchestras for the cream of recent graduates to tour the whole world as the cream of Europe. I still don't know. One of them had its offices just up the road here at Wootton by Woodstock, and 2 months after June 2016, it moved its offices from Oxfordshire to Antwerp, because it had to be in the EU. We heard about the European Medicines Agency, which was right by Imperial College Medical, and loads of transfer of knowledge between those organisations, which is now lost. The thing I really want to talk about, though, is security. Increasingly, people I am talking to are thinking about whether we're reliving the 1920s and walking into conflict in Western Europe. Adenauer and Schuman set up the Iron Seal Coal Community, EC, EU, because we'd had the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, where all the governments of Western Europe sent all their young men between 18 and 40 to go and kill one another.
So what's your question?
And we don't want that to happen again. And the person who's really gleeful about all of this is Putin. So would the panel please talk about the international aspect of this and the big hole that we will leave in Brussels if the EU ever leaves? Sorry, if the UK ever leaves.
Yes, I mean, one of the things we could do is teach our history. Our history is that we have gone to war in Europe where we felt excluded from Europe. And now we're trying to exclude ourselves from Europe, which seems to me a rather daft thing. I mean, we went to war against Napoleon for precisely those reasons, with the Spanish too, before that, and then with Germany. And we were part of the Cold War when we felt threatened that we could be excluded from this great continent. And the second thing I would say is that there's a wider thing here, because you mentioned security, which is all the big problems we face, all of them are international. I was at the European Cancer Conference before Christmas, and some of our European colleagues were really saddened by the idea that there'll be some kind of barrier or boundary, because there's no boundary with cancer or medical knowledge or security or terrorism or questions about migration or poverty and so on. These are international issues. So yes, I mean, fundamentally you're right, and the idea that we can go back to being splendidly isolated is just not the case. And that's why I say that if we crash out on October 31st, Brexit will only begin, because we will have years of negotiations trying to repair the damage that we've already done.
Okay, one last question. The lady at the front, right at the front.
Sarah Jane Smith. One thing that the gentleman over there briefly touched on that's become more and more apparent to me is, there's a lot said about people voting for Brexit, also racist. I don't think it's necessarily racism, but what's become more and more apparent is there seems to be, among many people, this sort of inbred British psyche, this British exceptionalism. It's like we've been fed a diet of World War II films, and instead of sort of focusing on the horrors of war, I think we've been largely led to believe we were plucky little Britain that once had an empire, and we stood on our own, and we won the war by ourselves. There's no element of teamwork with the other members of Europe and all over the world. And this is just my opinion, and I may be wrong, but I think this is part of the problem. And it was really emphasised today, and I overheard something on radio, it's a lady banging on about World War II and rations. And she was talking about it's great and how we survived. And that seems to be a lot of rhetoric. And, leaders are now admitting, yes, the unicorns and Solly Tottenhams are coming true, but, rather than trying to say, point is how do we counteract that?
How do you counteract it?
Well, I just say very briefly that the people who later on about how wonderful the war was, didn't seem to be doing any of the fighting, because the ones that I've spoken to didn't think that World War II was such a great idea, because they ended up either with rations if they were on the home front, or our own relatives, when they talked about it, they said how hard and difficult it was. So I agree with you. I find it extraordinary and reprehensible that we're wittering on about Spitfires and a generation that sacrificed so much for us, when we should be talking about artificial intelligence and how to rebuild the economy for the 21st century.
Thank you all very much for your questions. Now is the opportunity for Rachel and Gavin just to say very few closing words.
Well, I'd just say something very, very brief, which is, it's very good to see so many people who could be doing something else on a night like this, engaging in a civilized conversation, asking intelligent questions, and I hope going home with a bigger sense of hope. We can turn this around. There's a Remain majority in this country, and our country is better than Brexit.
And just to follow on from that, that's the essence of it. We are a Remain majority. And so if all of us speak out and use our voices and act through speaking, then we can change this. But it requires all of us to not become silent, to not give up. So please go home and, inspired by this evening, write your MP, tweet, get onto Facebook, do whatever small acts of speaking out you think you can manage. Talk to your die-hard Brexit neighbour. All of these are valuable, and collectively they will overturn the decision.
Thank you. I just want to take the opportunity again to thank Rachel and Gavin both for coming. We've learned a huge amount this evening, and you've already picked up some of what I was going to say to finish, which was let's keep fighting, and we now have more facts, more hope, and more enthusiasm, I hope, as we leave to do that. So thank you again, and please join me in thanking the two speakers.